Hello, I'm Michael Wunsch. I'm the plant pathologist at the North Dakota State University Carrington Research Extension Center. I'd like to share what we have learned in over a decade and a half of fungicide efficacy testing on dry beans. This presentation will focus on the efficacy of ENDURA versus competitive standards. Testing was conducted with pinto beans in most studies and kidney beans in some studies. Row spacing was 14 inches in almost all studies. Seeding rate was 90,000 viable seeds an acre in most studies, sometimes 80,000 viable seeds an acre. Fungicide spray volume was 15 gallons an acre. Fungicides were applied with a handheld boom pressurized by carbon dioxide. Fungicide droplet size was fine or medium in studies conducted from 2010 to 2021 and thereafter calibrated relative to canopy characteristics. 2 applications were made, with the first application at early bloom and initial pin pod, and the second application at 7 to 14 days later, depending on the study. Studies were conducted with 5 or 6 experimental replicates in almost all cases. White mold was assessed at or near dry bean maturity by evaluating every plant individually for the percent of plant impacted by white mold in a minimum half of the plot. To ensure that differences in lodging across the footprint of the study did not bias the yields, we clipped the plants at the base, windrow dried them down, and passed the dried down plants through the combine rather than straight harvesting. Supplemental irrigation was applied as needed to establish white mold disease pressure across these studies so that we could evaluate fungicide performance. To emphasize, testing was conducted with 2 sequential fungicide applications of the same fungicide in almost all of the studies. The goal here was to compound differences in efficacy, because when you apply the same product twice at the same application rate, you compound any differences, and that gives you a better ability to rigorously assess comparative efficacy. Now, even though we applied with 2 sequential applications, these results are meant to help guide a single application or guide selection of products when identifying products to use in rotation with each other. Okay. Now I'm going to begin with fungicides and fungicide application rates that can be applied by label twice in the season. Again, these results are meant to guide decision making for single application as well, but these can legally be applied twice in the same season. Let's start with Omega at 13.6 fluid ounces versus ENDURA at 8 ounces. What you can see is that we did not have statistical separation between these 2 fungicide treatments, but there was a clear trend with Omega performing better than the ENDURA. Moving on to comparison of ENDURA versus Propulse, we have combined analysis across 20 studies for this comparison. And what you can see is that the 10.3 fluid ounce rate of Propulse and the 8 ounce rate of ENDURA are very similar. There's a slight trend towards improved yields and lower disease with the 8 ounce rate of ENDURA versus the Propulse, but there's no statistical separation. Now looking at ENDURA at 8 ounces versus Propulse at 8.6 fluid ounces, this is the combined analysis across 10 studies. What you see is the same relationship. No statistical separation between these 2 fungicide treatments, but a clear trend with ENDURA providing better disease control and better yield than the Propulse. That trend evaporated, however, once we applied ENDURA at 8 fluid ounces. So that's rate dependent. You can see that 8 fluid ounces of Omega performed very similarly to 8 ounces of ENDURA. And we needed that 13.6 fluid ounce rate in order to see a pronounced trend of higher white mold management with Omega. So Omega is rate dependent. What about Topsin? Here is 8 ounces of ENDURA versus 30 fluid ounces of Topsin. You can see no statistical separation, but there's a clear trend where the ENDURA is performing slightly better than the Topsin at 30 fluid ounces. What about ENDURA versus ENDURA plus the copper-based fungicide Badge? Badge is often added when growers are worried about bacterial diseases, and they want to have something in the tank that's going to have some efficacy against bacterial diseases. And I often get the question, well, what does it do to the white mold fungicide? Well, these results indicate that it's not deleterious to the white mold fungicide. If anything, it helps out a little bit with white mold management. Now we're going to look at ENDURA versus Miravis Neo. Here we have statistical separation in terms of the white mold disease control and the yield, with ENDURA performing much better than Miravis Neo at 13.7 fluid ounces. Now we have ENDURA versus Approach. Same story. The ENDURA is providing statistically significant differences of improved white mold management in yield and disease control relative to the Approach. What about ENDURA versus Proline? Same thing. The ENDURA is performing much better than the Proline. Now, what about ENDURA versus Quash? Quash is another triazole fungicide, similar to Proline. And in this case, it's applied at 2.5 ounces an acre. And you can see statistical separation between the ENDURA and the Quash. What about ENDURA versus Quash at 4 ounces? Same story. The ENDURA is much more effective than the Quash. What about ENDURA versus Rovrol and Switch? Rovrol and Switch are labeled for white mold management on dry beans. They're rarely utilized. These results indicate that the ENDURA may be more effective, but we don't know that for certain because we don't have statistical separation. But you can see a very clear trend where the ENDURA conferred better disease management and higher yields than the Rovrol and the Switch. What about Verticin? Verticin is another SDHI Frac 7 fungicide, just like ENDURA, but in this case you can see that it is less effective than the ENDURA at white mold management, even when the Verticin is applied at a relatively high rate of 20 or 24 fluid ounces an acre. What about ENDURA applied twice versus ENDURA followed by Praxor? What you can see is that we do not have statistical separation between these treatments, but there's a clear trend where the ENDURA applied twice is performing better than the ENDURA followed by Praxor. I'd like to now discuss the efficacy of Topsin or generic Topsin applied at 40 fluid ounces relative to ENDURA. I'd like to preface this discussion by mentioning that the labels for all the Topsin products, including the generics, used to explicitly prohibit 240 fluid ounce applications per season, and some of the labels still prohibit 2 applications of 40 fluid ounces in the season. Other labels are more vague and recommend applying at 30 to 40 fluid ounces when you're making a single application, and recommend applying at 20 to 30 fluid ounces when you're making 2 or more applications, but fail to explicitly prohibit 2 applications at 40 fluid ounces. My interpretation from all the labels, however, is that Topsin can only legally be applied at 40 fluid ounces an acre in a single application per season. And if you're going to make 2 applications of Topsin in the season, you must apply at 30 fluid ounces. If you decide to make 2 applications of 40 fluid ounces, I'd recommend that you read the label very carefully and you check with the manufacturer to make sure that it's legal. My interpretation is that it is not. That said, I am now going to present efficacy data where we did apply Topsin or generic Topsin at 40 fluid ounces twice. And we did this only because this allowed us to test comparative efficacy within our existing fungicide protocols, where we were testing everything twice sequentially in order to compound the differences in efficacy and better differentiate efficacy. These results are shared explicitly for helping you select application rates when you're making a single application of Topsin in the season, either as a standalone application or in a rotational program with another fungicide. Here are the results for Topsin applied twice at 40 fluid ounces versus ENDURA applied twice at 8 ounces per acre. Again, it is my understanding from the label that 40 fluid ounces of Topsin an acre may only applied once. And what you can see is that we got better disease management out of the Topsin applied twice at 40 fluid ounces. Again, I would recommend that you utilize this information only for making single application of Topsin in the season, whether it's a standalone application or in rotation with ENDURA. And when you're going to apply Topsin at 40 fluid ounces in rotation with ENDURA, you see the same trend that we just saw. You see that although we did not have statistical separation in this case, you can see at least equal or slightly better white mold management with that fungicide rotation program than ENDURA applied twice. So if you're going to rotate Topsin and ENDURA, should the Topsin be applied first or should the Topsin be applied second? In the combined analysis across 7 studies, we have seen a trend where applying the topsin first and the ENDURA second is advantageous versus the reverse. And again, in these, across all 7 studies, now you can see that same trend that we saw before, where using that rotation strategy of topsin first at 40 fluid ounces and ENDURA second at 8 ounces, you get slightly better disease management. Again, that's a trend, but you can see it's consistent in the disease data and the yield. So, what have we learned? If you're going to make 2 applications in the season, the most effective fungicides are Omega at 13.6 fluid ounces, ENDURA at 8 ounces, Propulse at 10.3 fluid ounces, and Topsin at 30 fluid ounces, roughly in that order. Remember, if you reduce the application rate of Omega, you will reduce its efficacy. If you're only making a single application this season, that efficacy ranking changes to Omega at 13.6 fluid ounces, Topsin at 40 fluid ounces, ENDURA at 8 ounces, Propulse at 10.3 fluid ounces. Thus, Topsin at 40 fluid ounces is a very good rotational treatment with another fungicide. And if you're going to rotate Topsin with ENDURA, our research indicates that you should apply the Topsin first at 40 fluid ounces, then ENDURA second. Our research indicates that the following fungicides are less effective than ENDURA: Proline, Quash, Miravis Neo, applied at 13.6 fluid ounces, Rovrol, Switch, and Priaxor, applied at 4 fluid ounces. I'd like to give some very sincere thanks to my staff in Carrington, Aaron Faust, Sue Collis, Jesse Hafter, and Gabby Henson. These are my current staff, and my former staff, Thomas Miorini, Billy Kraft, and Michael Schaefer. These individuals have put in very long hours to facilitate the successful execution of this research. I'd also like to give sincere thanks to the staff in Langdon who contributed to this research. Scott Halley, the now retired plant pathologist from Langdon, and Amanda Ahrens, who is still a research specialist up in Langdon, working in plant pathology. Finally, I'd like to give sincere thanks to the North Harvest Bean Growers Association, the North Dakota Crop Protection Product Harmonization and Registration Board, administered by the North Dakota Department of Agriculture, and the private companies who funded this research. I'd also like to give sincere thanks to Bollingburg Seeds, Green Valley Bean Company, and the Kelly Bean Company in Hatton, North Dakota, who donated the seed used in these research studies and our other white mold management research studies in dry beans. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope that these research results help improve your operations.